Let's begin by meeting the Beecham family. This photograph from the Turnbull Library collection was taken in the late 1890s, around the time the family spent their first summer on this side of the harbour. So here we see Harold and Annie Beecham with their 5 children. On the right is Kathleen, the middle child, better known, of course, as Katherine Mansfield. Although the Burnell family in At the Bay is loosely based on Mansfield's own family, she did change a number of details. For example, there are only 4 Burnell children in the story, and also they are several years younger than the Beecham children were at the time. As noted in your programme, the old photographs used in our tribute to At the Bay are all from the Historical Society of Eastbourne's archive collection. But now we're going to show you a few other photographs from the collection that we didn't use to give you an idea of what this place looked like around the time the story is set. Like the story itself, we start with a crescent-shaped bay with rocky headlands at each end and a dusty road skirting the beach. This is Days Bay in 1906. Mansfield's father, Harold Beecham, had recently purchased a piece of land at Downs Point at the northern end of the bay and had a small cottage built there for family use. Mansfield described the cottage: a small poverty-stricken sitting room, a cabin-like bedroom fitted with bunks, and an outhouse with a bath and a wood cellar, coal cellar complete. There was no garden, just the sea stretching right up to the yard. In the 18 months before she left New Zealand for good in 1908, Mansfield used the cottage as a welcome bolt hole from the city. By then she would have been in her late teens. On one occasion, she and her sister Charlotte, accompanied by their maid, came to bathe and row and walk in the bush or by the sea. The crescent shape of the bay, and the family having owned a cottage here, pointed to Days Bay being the setting for At the Bay. And for many years that was what everyone assumed, and some people still do. But in other ways, Days Bay does not fit the story very well. For example, surely that cottage would have been too small to accommodate a family of 4 adults and 4 children, plus a servant girl. And where are the bungalows of the summer colony with their gardens of marigolds and pinks, and the paddocks and sand dunes that Stanley races across to have his early morning swim? And what about the store with the big gum tree in front, where Alice the maid goes to have afternoon tea with Mrs. Stubbs? To answer these questions, we need to travel further south and to go back a few years. But before we do, I'd like to point out a few landmarks that would have been familiar to Mansfield during her visits to Days Bay. This photograph shows the popular Days Bay resort in its heyday, when it was known as Wellington's Playground. The wharf is where the big steam ferries brought literally thousands of day trippers across from town on weekends and public holidays. Road access around the harbour was very poor, so the families of the summer colony would also have come over by ferry, with a servant bringing the luggage and the provisions by horse and dray, as in the story Prelude. Opposite the wharf is the ornate pavilion, which served lunches and afternoon teas. We can also see the bathing huts on the beach, the tennis courts, the famous water slide, and the hockey fields. And in the hills beyond, a network of popular bush tracks. North of the pavilion is Days Bay House, a grand hotel built in 1903 to attract well-to-do holidaymakers. It was not a success, and in 1913 was sold and converted to a private school for boys. In 1940, that school became Wellesley College, which is, of course, where we are this evening. So this is the bay where Mansfield and her sister would swim, row, and walk, and maybe they also played tennis on these courts and took afternoon tea at the pavilion. But now we're heading south, following the road around Windy Point, through Rona Bay and on to Miratai, the name for the southern part of Eastbourne. And this is our destination, the Glen, seen here in 1913. In 1969, a Mansfield scholar by the name of Maud Morris published an article in the Turnbull Library Record in which she argued that this property, and not the Downs Point cottage, was the setting for At the Bay. In the late 1930s, her husband, Guy Morris, had corresponded with Harold Beecham, who told Morris he had rented this cottage for his family for several summers, starting, we believe, in 1899, when Mansfield was 11. The property was then owned by Mr. Sidney Burrode, a banking associate of Beecham's. Interestingly, Beecham claimed that he never stayed a night at the Glen. I wonder if he wished to dissociate himself from his daughter's portrayal of Stanley Burnell. As we can see, the Glen does tick more boxes than the Downs Point cottage as the setting for the story. For example, there's the veranda where the bathing dresses and towels were hung to dry. The grass patch in front where we can imagine Linda and the baby resting under the manuka tree, which rather oddly has yellow flowers in the story. The surrounding bush and hills with a stream flowing down to the right of the house. Start of sight. This wider view of Miratai was taken in 1902, the final year that Mansfield spent a summer holiday here. The Glen is just out of sight on the left. So here is the summer colony, just as Mansfield describes it. The scattering of bungalows, most of them holiday homes owned by Wellington families. The paddocks with their awkward stiles, the sand dunes, and the long white sand beach where the summer colony came down to bathe. On the other hand, Miratai is clearly not a crescent-shaped bay, and the road runs inland here, not alongside the beach as it does in Days Bay. But what we can see in the foreground are the horse bus stables owned by Mr. Dennis Kelly. I'm impressed that Mansfield remembered his name 20 years later. He was said to be a jovial soul, though rather unreliable, owing to his fondness for drink. We can even see a horse bus, or coach as Stanley calls it, parked outside and two horses standing in the yard. And here is one of Kelly's coaches. This is how Stanley would have begun his morning commute to town, wearing his blue serge suit, stiff collar and bowler hat. It evidently got very hot and stuffy in there, especially when it rained and the canvas sides had to be rolled down. And a bit further south is Miratai Park Store, located just off the road with a large tree in front, two big windows for eyes and a broad veranda for a hat, just as Mansfield describes Mrs. Stubbs's store. Harold Beecham recalled the store being about opposite the Glen and thought it had been run by a Mrs. Jones. He described her as quite an original character and fancied that his daughter made some use of her in one or two of her stories. So Mrs. Jones could well have been the inspiration for Mrs. Stubbs. There are other possible models for Mrs. Stubbs' store, but I must say I prefer this one. So there you have it, two holiday cottages in two very different bays, both with strong connections to Mansfield's time here, yet neither a perfect fit with the story. It seems clear that when Mansfield was writing her story 20 years later, she drew intensively on her memories of both Days Bay and Miratai, and also that she selected, merged and shaped those memories to suit her creative purpose.